I mean, I'll talk from a Grocon perspective, and for those of you who've grown up in Melbourne, Grocon is a large builder, developer and owner of real estate, and whilst property is about a third in direct and indirect ways of the Australian economy, the bit that we play in is actually relatively small because it is residential and commercial office, so industrial and infrastructure and all those other things that make up part of that pie are not where we play, and I won't comment on those. But picking up some of the other comments that we've already had, housing and housing policy and what I'll call the long-term policy sort of position and settings for Australia generally is a big problem. So whether we look at under-investment in infrastructure and rail and roads and all that sort of stuff that keeps the economy going, or whether we just look at the spikes that we saw in those graphs that Alan put up that talked around where pricing has gone for houses and how affordable that is. There was a big line up there for Sydney that's shown, you know, the amount of new housing coming on in Sydney in the current market, but then also the lack of affordability of that housing for average Australians, which is picking up the other comments that's been made. Effectively, that's come from 10, maybe 20 years of undersupply of housing into the Sydney housing market. When the Olympics came to Sydney, New South Wales took the view that we're full, we don't need anyone else, and frankly, we're doing pretty well on our own, and we don't need to change too much. And the concept of that these days is that that housing market is still recovering to provide enough supply so that population growth can be provided in the areas that people want to live in Sydney. So there's different elements of that playing out in Melbourne, and for all the reasons that we talked about, Perth and Brisbane and some of those regional centres are a different case in point again. But for the two biggest property markets in the country, which is Melbourne and Sydney, there are some really long-term legacy issues around the fact that none of our governments, and to a part business as well, have not looked 30 and 50 years forward the way some of the other performing nations would do. Instead, we're looking sort of one government out and maybe 5 years out, and if we're looking at something 10 years out, then we're giving ourselves a big pat on the back. But for the macro elements that are playing into some of that space, I would say we've been reasonably complacent. And if we want to see something better for the future that lines up some of the issues that we've talked about this morning, there probably needs to be just a whole shift in mindset to get to that point. Having said that, there's a lot of construction activity here in Melbourne. For those people who look at the number of cranes on the skyline as a bit of an indicator of how much economic activity is going on, there's obviously a lot, and you can see it out the window here. Construction is a big employer, so there's lots of positives in that. I will say, in terms of the residential market, we do get, I think, fixated with apartments in CBD locations as opposed to all the other residential activity that's happening either in those inner suburbs that are now going through massive urban renewal, and then the suburbs further out. And there's issues there around who wants to live out there and who wants to live in here and what are those livability elements. But by and large, as a developer of that kind of product, we would say the residential market is very strong. And unless there's some reason to think that population growth is going to come off in a significant way, we don't see that fundamentally changing. The concept of do we want to, at the moment, do big apartments in the city, or are we looking at other locations, is probably the question for a business like ours, and we have made some slight changes to direction in what we are doing as a business. The other thing I thought I would pick up is commercial office and corporates, and in that space I would say it's hard to understand from post-GFC, where we first saw that big activity in large employers doing that cost-cutting and productivity, and whether they're getting it out of their premises or their headcount or where they're finding it, but that is still going on in one way or another. We create lots of big buildings for large corporates in Australia, and I would say at least half of those are coming from corporates who actually want to downsize their real estate bill, take less space, and the only way they can do that, given the size of the buildings they currently occupy, is actually to move. So NAB is in a slightly different place, I think. But if you're a bank and a big organisation as big as NAB, and you've got however many thousand employees that you have these days, the concept of saying we're going to be in the one building and we're all going to shrink back and occupy less space, and these are all the changes that we're going to do. At a cultural level in Australia, what we see corporates doing is actually saying we're going to deliver you all of those cutbacks, smaller space and sit closer together, and no one's having any paper, and we're not going to have any storage and all those kind of things, which from a sustainability point of view is great, but we're delivering those in a package that says let's go to a new building where the overall cost comes down. So for developers who are producing that stock, it's actually very good, but when you look at the underlying impetus for what is driving that, it's actually about reducing footprint. So the commercial office markets across the country as a result of that are relatively soft. Landlords are paying big incentives to get those tenants to move, and yeah, at the bottom of that is an issue around saying, are we seeing growth in those sectors or not? And I think that comes back to, you know, business confidence, and are people seeing growth in wages, and where does all that fit in? The only other thing I'll pick up on, because it's been set off this morning, I guess, is that role that people in real estate play in that housing market. Certainly, Grocon has had a view for about 10 years. It was led by Daniel Guolo originally, that for what we do every day, which is creating buildings, there's part of what we can do that feeds directly into the housing sector, the not-for-profit sector, the people who provide long-term homelessness accommodation and affordable accommodation. Businesses like Haven, and we work with a number of people across that sector where we say what we do every day should include a very tangible direct benefit into some of those, I'll call you a business, you're not really a business, but a provider of that sort of stock. And that's included about 400 apartments in different locations across Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, where we've said we'll do those buildings at cost. We've had subcontractors come on with us and say they'll put their bid in as cost as well. And for the project we did here in Elizabeth Street, we actually gave about $10 million back to the government and said, please put that into the next project. Hopefully that provides some more housing for those people who are at risk. And it is very clearly a growing issue, not a declining one, which for a country like Australia, in amongst all those slides relative to the rest of the world, we're in a great place to live, and we have a level of prosperity that we largely take for granted.